What value is there in a peace made through violence? A peace kept by threat of violence? On his third entry to the Patlabor franchise, director Mamoru Oshii offered its most political take yet. A stark departure from any of its predecessors to the point it could really stand on its own. Oshii once said, "In Patlabor 2, I wanted to describe the Cold War for Japan. It was a war, but a silent war." When the Cold War existed between the US and Russia, the stance of Japan was not to be directly involved. Even though Japan was involved, it kept insisting for 50 years that it wasn't. I wanted to describe that fake peace. The 1993 film Patlabor 2 is a film born through Oshii's distaste for this illusion. It's in the contradiction between Japan's posturing as a model for peaceful arbitration of international order, and its complicity and even privatization in the US's global hegemony, enforced through violent means. Because the film is deeply rooted in Japanese politics of the time, Oshii has expressed it may be difficult for foreign viewers, particularly Americans, to fully grasp. But even without that context specific to Japan, the broader strokes of the film's message are just as relevant today as they were 25 years ago. By examining the political parallels Oshii draws upon both allegorically and directly in Patlabor 2, we can put the film in its historical context, reconcile the balance between Japan's post-World War II pacifism and its Cold War remilitarization, and offer Oshii's own perspective on the cycle of war and the illusion of peace. In order to best capture the political headspace Oshii undertook with this film, we have to understand the history behind it, at least at a very high level, particularly as it relates to the JSDF. During the years of US occupation after World War II, Japan was essentially left with no military force. Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan, drawn up by the United States in 1947, required the country renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes, and prohibited them from amassing land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential. The terms left Japanese security in the hands of the local police force, who had little in the way of professional military capacity, and the American occupying forces, who were engaged in the Korean War through the early 50s. In response to this defenseless state and with the cooperation of the US, Japan established the better-equipped National Police Reserve, later reorganized in 1954 to the Japan Self-Defense Force, JSDF, consisting of ground, air, and maritime branches. A guiding principle of this de facto military was bunmin tosei, civilian control, a check that saw the power of civilian officials in the defense ministry elevated above uniformed officers of the JSDF, in hopes of avoiding the atrocities of Japan's recent military past. The terms of Article 9 and civilian control served to restrict the power and reach of the JSDF to its founding doctrine as a strictly domestic outfit, meant to protect Japanese territory from foreign invasion, provide disaster relief, and aid in peacekeeping efforts, but not be deployed in any offensive capacity on foreign soil. In Patlabor 2, Oshii draws on Japan's involvement in multinational peacekeeping operations, or PKOs, and its cooperative but foundationally one-sided relationship with the United States, particularly as it pertains to Japanese security and involvement in the US's global police strategy under the guise of peacekeeping. Kevin Cooney, in his book Japan's Foreign Policy Since 1945, writes, "An example of the rules Japan has placed on its SDF forces is that, until recently under Japanese law, officers and non-commissioned officers were not permitted to order their troops to fire or withhold fire. This rule effectively prevented the SDF troops from acting as a unit in any combat situation, thus destroying their effectiveness." Patlabor 2 opens to an SDF unit on the ground somewhere in Southeast Asia brandishing a United Nations outfit. It's clearly meant to evoke the 1992 UNTAC peacekeeping operation in Cambodia, in which 2 Japanese lives were lost in an operation the government otherwise deemed a success, and even the model by which future Japanese involvement in PKOs should be judged. Even so, most blame the deaths on this forced disengagement. In the film, the squad leader, later revealed to be the film's antagonist Tsuge, requests permission to engage with an approaching platoon that has an armored vehicle, but his superiors deny him, telling him to do their best to evade until Canadian reinforcements arrive. After one of the pilots is killed because of an equipment malfunction with his mobile unit, the rest of Tsuge's squad is wiped out one by one. Oshii said he wanted to illustrate how ill-prepared the SDF would be to take on such a situation due to the lack of will afforded them by their agreements with the UN and US. Sent to a foreign land with shoddy equipment, forced to disengage and watch as his squad were all killed, Oshii establishes Tsuge's desire to punish the political system that put him there. As with many of his films, Oshii does not object with his antagonist's goals, rather the means through which he achieves them. On the contrary, he uses his antagonist as a reflection of his own ideals. He once said, "Tsuge is the other self of Mamoru Oshii. Tsuge's political thoughts and opinions, if there are any, are all mine." In particular, Oshii seems to resonate with Tsuge's opposition to this false peace, one made through colonial and imperial violence. He wants to attack the hypocrisy of Japan's post-World War II peace, and its benefiting off the globalized violence through the same period. The ramifications of the US-Japan security relationship throughout the Cold War forms a crux of the film's politics, particularly in regards to the SDF intelligence officer Arakawa. Similar to Tsuge, Arakawa is wary of the illusory, hollow peace he believes has lulled the nation to sleep, blind to their complicit role in wars waged elsewhere around the globe. He tells Goto, "While we gladly reap the benefits that come with war, we distance ourselves from it. We banish war to a realm beyond the TV screen. We pretend to forget that we ourselves are on the rear lines of battle." He views it as the SDF and police forces' responsibility to maintain peace, but believes the peace they protect to be hypocritical. Mark Anderson, in his article, Oshii Mamoru's Patlabor 2, Terror, Theatricality, and Exceptions That Prove the Rule, writes, "To counter how the Japanese state has made a fetish of peace, Arakawa offers a larger view that reveals Japan's implication in regimes of force. Japan relies on such regimes, but continues to disavow them through its professed adherence to Article 9 and its refusal to fully participate in UN peacekeeping missions." In Arakawa's conversation with Goto through the middle of the film on the nature of Japan's current state, Oshii makes his strongest statement. Half the world is locked in a cycle of civil war, ethnic strife, and armed conflict. Our economic prosperity is based on demand created by those countless wars. Its hands are covered in blood. That's the stuff our peace is made of. An unabashed lust for peace based on an unmitigated terror of war. An unjust peace, where we avert our eyes from the foreign wars, in which others pay the price for that peace. In the film, this illusion blinds Tokyo and the bureaucrats who run it to the conflict that has bubbled under the surface far longer than they realize. A common theme throughout the film is preparing for the worst-case scenario. You see it early on as Ota forces the cadets to practice firing with their labors using manual controls. When one asks him why, when the automated fire control system has a 98% hit ratio, Ota tells him, "Training to prepare for that 1 in a million is our job as cops." As the threat of an open war looms, Nagumo and Goto are repeatedly given orders from their superiors to be ready in the event of a worst-case scenario, never seeing that with each step they take in anticipation of it, they push that closer and closer to reality. The government here frequently withholds information from the general public, essentially lying to them for fear of inducing a panic and creating that worst-case situation, playing right into Tsuge's hands, whose goal is to sow discord between the branches of the military and Japanese government to disrupt the political status quo. Often, by the time a first shot is fired, the war has already begun, but the players behind it and the observers looking on were too willfully blind to see it. As Arakawa says, and Goto later echoes, this war has been going on for a long time. The question becomes how to stop it. The incompetence of the civilian leaders of the defense ministry in defusing the situation illustrates another of the film's issues with Japan's post-war politics. Despite its original intent as a democratic check on the authoritarian power of the pre-war military, the film argues this system leaves the country no less susceptible to abuse by the state, here at the hands of bureaucratic manipulation. Arakawa notes how the government shifts its scapegoat from the SDF to the police force based on whoever provides the best cover at the time. Everyone is acting in their own self-interest. They claim to be preparing for the worst-case scenario, but really it's all politicking. During their interrogation, Nagumo and Goto call them out on this deflection of blame for their own political gain as having endangered the public even further. Quoting James Dunnigan's How to Make War, Goto proclaims, "The farther away from the slaughter, the more optimism replaces reality. Reality is often non-existent at the highest decision-making levels. This is especially true when you are losing a war." And perhaps the film's most evocative sequence, at one point the government institutes a state of martial law in Tokyo, stationing JG SDF forces on the ground in place of the police force to, quote, "prevent the outbreak of a foreseeable worst-case scenario." A montage of shots of the military weaving into the very fabric of day-to-day society in Tokyo proves especially haunting. These soldiers aren't here to wage war. They're ordinary citizens too, made to pose a deterrence by suits in a stuffy conference room. Snow begins to fall on Tokyo, creating this tranquil atmosphere filled with a sense of disquiet. A sign in the window of a store reads "Light and Shadow" in French, with the silhouette of a soldier out front. Everything about this feels out of place. The threat they represent is undeniable. By their presence, Tsuge has succeeded in revealing the fragile nature of this city's peace simply by knocking over the first domino. Ultimately, the government plays no role in stopping Tsuge at all. Only the extra-legal efforts of the SV2 unit bring the conflict to an end. When Nagumo confronts him, she says, even if it is an illusion, there are those who accept it as reality and live in it. As much as Oshii, like Tsuge, may want to see the illusion struck down, in the end he can't bring himself to destroy it so easily. To that end, he echoes Nagumo. While she too holds the civilian leadership in contemptuous regard and even directly rebukes them, she can't bring herself to side with Tsuge either. To her, his dismissal of the citizens of Tokyo as a wash in a false world discredits their lives as equally fake. The individual value each of them has is very real. Oshii put it thusly: if you depict it as a city which you won't miss even if it were destroyed, as a fake thing made from only steel and concrete from the beginning, destroying it won't accomplish anything. It's far from being a real catharsis. Even in Tokyo, if you look carefully, if you dig up your memories, you can find some scenery which you are very much attracted to. It can be the evening at the train crossing, or it can be scenery of some vacant land with Seitaka Awadachi-so in Tokyo Bay area. We have scenery we love inside of us. It's related to our childhood memories. If you depict Tokyo that way, and depict it as something you still have to destroy, I can understand that. In this way, Oshii falls in line with Tsuge's sentiments, that perhaps there was still a part of him that wanted to see a little more of this city's future, of its illusion. In an interview with Animerica in 1996, a few years after the film's release, Oshii was asked how the recent Tokyo subway sarin attack reflected a similar scene in Patlabor 2, and whether this sort of domestic terrorism actually happening would force people to take the message of this work more seriously. Not quite, Oshii said. If people were really capable of realizing those dangers, I wouldn't have to make my films. Does that mean you think people still aren't waking up to reality? That's correct. Even with over 2 decades past, Patlabor 2's political commentary has hardly aged a day. Oshii's voice is not drowned in ideology here, rather packed with nuance. It's as much a warning as a statement. Is there more value in an unjust peace over a just war? Patlabor 2 argues the line between them is far murkier than it appears, that perhaps the illusion is thinking it's still possible to distinguish the two at all.